The only thing I wish about leaving NBC is that it ended on a more gracious note. And maybe we'll circle back and make that right at some point, make it completely right.
Do you think that'll happen? The only question I had on kind of the ending of the relationship with NBC is this. You were there 40 years. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts on just why it ended unceremoniously?
When Comcast took over NBC, they couldn't have been nicer to me. They treated me wonderfully. But there were times when my notions, especially as I got to be older, you didn't have baseball anymore, didn't have the NBA anymore. I had ambivalent feelings about football. It was getting to where I'd done 10, 11, 12 Olympics. Some of those Olympics were in places like China and Sochi, Russia. Somebody's got to acknowledge the elephants in those rooms. And there were times when that created tension, and I thought that my own credibility was at stake.
Super Bowl 2012, Indianapolis. Yeah. You're hosting a magazine-style show for NBC Sports Network.
Yes.
Similar to kind of what you do for HBO. Mm-hmm. Concussion panel. Patriots owner Bob Kraft's on it.
Yep.
Explain what happened in the subsequent fallout.
That was interesting. The Comcast guys said, we'll replicate the HBO show. And they did. And that was the very first show from the site of the Super Bowl. People loved it. So it was well received, but part of the focus naturally was CTE. And Bob Kraft's reaction was, we're on the verge of the Super Bowl and this is too negative. When I signed my last contract at NBC in 2012, it contained an emeritus clause. I told them I wanted the 2016 Olympics and that football season to be my last. They came to me in 2015 and they asked if I had a change of heart. I said, absolutely not, we'll stick with the plan. But it included an emeritus clause where I would be to sports for the next 5 years and maybe beyond that, what Tom Brokaw had been to news after he gave up the anchor seat. Very appealing, made a lot of sense. But then some of the things I said, both on NBC and in other places.
Link between brain damage and
brain
the NFL.
Damage, the NFL. And it got into a passive-aggressive place where I think maybe both parties couldn't see the forest for the trees. And I think that they began to view me as much as an annoyance as an asset. And after all that time, you say to yourself, hey, this isn't right. We've hit a point of diminishing returns. And I knew that if I left, that I could go to places where I'd be able to do what at that point I really wanted to do. There was no announcement. I didn't need a parade, but it would have been nice if I could have ended on a grace note. I didn't need a full-blown hour as a tribute to my career, as some people received. I would have been fine if they just had me do some sort of programming and then at the end, for 2 minutes, say goodbye. That didn't happen. And finally it got out because people wondered where I was, and so then it just came out like kind of in a press release. And what I regret, and I blame myself for this, ESPN, through Mark Fainaru-Wada, one of the most respected sports journalists, League of Denial, Game of Shadows, he says to me, in effect, I want to do an appreciation of your career. That's very flattering, very nice. Anyone would give him my respect for him and the way he laid it out. And he did a perfectly responsible job. But in retrospect, I know what happened. In a 2-hour sit-down, the producer saw the Geiger counter move in the 10 minutes or so that we talked about football and how football reigns over everything and how, I guess the money quote was, everyone walks on eggshells around the NFL. I never brought up the names of any of my NBC colleagues or bosses. Those names were filled in narration afterwards with their pictures because they put together that these were the people that decided that it was time to cut ties. So the way it was presented, at least from their perspective, I'm the hero of the story and they're the villains. I never felt that way. You go 40 years, there are going to be some bumps in the road, especially if you have any kind of independence of thought. And in the big picture, it was a great and productive relationship. Nothing that was in the televised piece was untrue. But let's say you were talking about a marriage or a long-time friendship, and the whole story became the time that you were at odds. Well, it might be true, but it's misleading in the big picture. So I get what the producer did. This is what moves the needle. This is the story. And then when it got out there, people misinterpreted it. One of the things that almost amused me was that supposedly I was upset because I lost the Super Bowl gig. I didn't care. I cared more about where I'd go for dinner that night. But naturally, that's the way idiots framed it. Like, oh, Bob, he wants to have it both ways. He wants to criticize the NFL, but he also wants to be the host of the Super Bowl. I didn't give a damn.
So to recap what you were saying, you just regret having participated in that story because had you known what the narrative would be from the outset, you never would have agreed to it.
Yes, the narrative became Bob versus NBC.
Right.
The only thing I wish about leaving NBC is that it ended on a more gracious note. And maybe we'll circle back and make that right at some point, make it completely right.
Do you think that'll happen?
I hope so. And I think there's a chance that it will.